You're watching the Everything Network. In the first decades of the 20th century, northeastern Pennsylvania was a struggle, a region of immigrant labor, coal mines, and small ethnic enclaves, where the promise of America was filtered through hardship. Among the Italian immigrants who settled there was Stephen Latour, a Sicilian-born stonemason who came to Pittston, near Scranton, in 1901. He was part of a generation that carried with it the customs and codes of southern Italy, traditions of loyalty, retribution, and quiet organization that would eventually take root as the first framework of organized crime in the region. Latour's early years in Pennsylvania were defined not by violence but by adaptation. The coal towns were harsh places, ruled as much by mining companies as by local ethnic blocs that provided a measure of protection and community. Extortion and blackmail existed in primitive form, the remnants of the old Black Hand system that preyed on frightened immigrants. Latour, intelligent and pragmatic, understood both sides of this world. He was a man who could mediate disputes as easily as he could enforce decisions. By the 1910s, he had emerged as a figure of quiet influence in Pittston's growing Italian underworld. Not yet a crime boss in the modern sense, but something close to a local arbiter of power. In these years, the idea of a family, as the mafia would later define it, did not yet exist in the American sense. Networks were fluid, based on regional or village origin. Latour's group, made up of Sicilians and Calabrians, managed gambling, small loans, and protection rackets, all while maintaining legitimate fronts in construction and hauling. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, the entire region changed. Illegal liquor became a unifying enterprise for scattered gangs. The rail lines and backroads that cut through Pennsylvania made it a natural corridor between the cities of the eastern seaboard, New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, and the industrial markets of the Midwest. By the late 1920s, the Pittston-Scranton network had matured. Latour's organization maintained contact with other rising powers, among them the Buffalo organization led by Stefano Magaddino and his influential associate, John C. Montana. Montana, an Italian-American businessman and political figure from Buffalo, represented the new model of criminal diplomacy, outwardly legitimate, inwardly connected to the expanding American Cosa Nostra. His relationship with Latour created a direct link between Pennsylvania and Western New York, ensuring a channel of communication and cooperation that would endure for decades. It was around this time that a young man named Russell Bufalino began to appear in these circles. Born Rosario Alberto Bufalino in Sicily in 1903, he immigrated to the United States as a child, growing up in Buffalo before moving to the Scranton area. He was quiet, disciplined, and unassuming, traits that would become his greatest strengths. Through his cousin Angelo Polizzi and other relatives tied to Magaddino's Buffalo organization, Russell established himself as a reliable operative. He worked under Latour, learning the art of control without exposure. While others sought recognition, Bufalino learned to disappear in plain sight. During the 1930s, as Prohibition ended and the American Mafia reorganized under the emerging commission system led by Charles "Lucky" Luciano, Latour's network found its place within the broader national hierarchy. Pennsylvania was small compared to New York, but strategically valuable, a neutral ground between powerful territories. When Luciano and his allies divided the national underworld into regional families, the Pittston operation was recognized as autonomous but closely tied to Buffalo. Stephen Latour, by then aging, preferred diplomacy to confrontation. His quiet approach mirrored that of his successors. By the late 1930s, Latour was stepping back from daily control, leaving Russell Bufalino effectively in charge of operations. It was a peaceful transfer, the kind of transition rare in organized crime. Bufalino, still in his 30s, consolidated the family's business interests, focusing on labor unions, garment trucking, and small manufacturing fronts. He developed legitimate enterprises, laundries, dress factories, and hauling firms that served as cover for more profitable ventures. His reputation as a man of integrity within the underworld grew rapidly. As World War II ended, the Mafia entered what historians call its golden age, a period of vast expansion into legitimate industries and labor. The National Commission, led by figures like Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, and later Vito Genovese, governed the underworld like a corporate board. Russell Bufalino, though never ostentatious, became known as one of its most capable mediators. From his modest base in Pittston, he oversaw a network that extended quietly into New York, New Jersey, and western Pennsylvania. His long-standing friendship with John C. Montana gave him influence in Buffalo, and his Sicilian ties ensured respect among the old guard. Bufalino's power came not from numbers. His family was small, perhaps a few dozen made men at its peak, but from relationships. He was known to Carlo Gambino, to Santo Trafficante in Florida, and to Genovese in New York. When disputes arose between families, Bufalino was often called to mediate. His manner was reserved, his voice calm, and his word trusted. He was a businessman in demeanor, always understated, rarely photographed. Through the 1950s, the Bufalino family thrived under this model. They controlled the garment and trucking industries across northeastern Pennsylvania and parts of New York. They influenced labor unions and maintained alliances with the Teamsters, particularly through intermediaries who dealt with Jimmy Hoffa and his associates. This connection would later draw Bufalino into the orbit of national scandals involving labor racketeering and organized crime's reach into legitimate business. But with expansion came exposure. In November 1957, a state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed suspicious activity near a country estate outside Appalachian, New York. The house belonged to Joseph Barbara, a local businessman and associate of Bufalino. What Croswell discovered would become one of the most infamous moments in Mafia history. Inside Barbara's home, dozens of top mob figures had gathered: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Santo Trafficante Jr., and others, for what was believed to be a national summit of the commission. Among them was Russell Bufalino, one of the key organizers of the meeting. When police raided the estate, the guests fled through woods and fields, scattering in expensive suits across the countryside. It was the moment the American public first truly saw the Mafia as a national institution. For Bufalino, the Appalachian raid was a disaster, not for his survival, but for his anonymity. He had spent decades cultivating invisibility, and now his name appeared in newspapers across the country. Federal agents began watching him closely, yet even then, they struggled to pin significant charges on him. He had no taste for publicity and rarely left evidence behind. Throughout the 1960s, Bufalino continued to exert quiet influence. He was considered by law enforcement to be one of the most powerful figures in the Northeast, yet his organization remained small and tightly knit. His friendship with Hoffa deepened. Some investigators later suspected Bufalino had played a role in Hoffa's disappearance in 1975, though no proof ever surfaced. To those who knew him, Bufalino was the quintessential, quiet Don, a man who preferred negotiation to bloodshed and control through respect rather than fear. The 1970s brought new challenges. The federal government, armed with the RICO Act, began dismantling mafia empires that had endured for half a century. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informants eroded the code of silence that had protected men like Bufalino for decades. His once safe Pennsylvania network became increasingly vulnerable to investigation. In 1977, Bufalino was indicted on extortion charges related to labor contracts and transportation kickbacks. Though convicted, he served relatively short sentences. Federal prosecutors saw him as an elder statesman of organized crime, cautious, elusive, and difficult to convict on major counts. Even in prison, he maintained authority, His word carried weight far beyond his small territory. By the 1980s, most of the old guard was gone. Carlo Gambino had died peacefully in 1976, Vito Genovese in prison a decade earlier. The American mafia was entering its decline, fragmented by law enforcement pressure and internal betrayal. Yet Bufalino remained. Reporters who saw him in court described him as soft-spoken, neatly dressed, and expressionless, a man who had mastered patience. He was released from prison in the early 1980s, but continued to face indictments through the decade. His family, while diminished, survived largely because of his caution. The Bufalino organization avoided drug trafficking, the trap that destroyed so many others. Instead, it clung to traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, union influence, and small business fronts. Russell Bufalino died in 1994 at the age of 90, one of the last major figures of the mafia's golden era. His death marked the end of an institution that had thrived for nearly a century. From Stephen LaTorre's modest beginnings to Bufalino's quiet rule, the family's story was one of endurance and subtlety. A criminal empire built not on spectacle, but on restraint. In the decades that followed, remnants of the family persisted under lower-profile successors. The modern underworld of Pennsylvania, stripped of its old structure, carried echoes of Bufalino's methods, discreet, disciplined, and cautious. Historians now regard Russell Bufalino as one of the most enigmatic figures in organized crime. Unlike Gotti or Capone, he left no flamboyant legacy, no headlines of violence or greed. His genius lay in invisibility. He was the man behind the curtain, the negotiator, the bridge, the stabilizer. In a world of volatile egos and public arrests, he maintained his dignity and control until the end. The Bufalino family's influence has faded into history, but its legacy endures as a testament to a different kind of power, the kind that survives by staying unseen. The aftermath of Appalachian reshaped the underworld's geography. For the first time, federal authorities recognized the mafia as an organized national network rather than isolated local gangs. The scandal forced even the most discreet families to adapt. For Russell Bufalino, it meant operating under the constant shadow of surveillance. His life's strategy, quiet, deliberate, invisible, had to be perfected further. In the years following 1957, the Bureau of Narcotics, the FBI, and state police departments built dossiers on every name recovered from the Appalachian attendance list. In those files, Bufalino appeared not as a triggerman or a racketeer, but as a broker, a man with influence disproportionate to his crew's size. He had long understood that power was measured not in soldiers but in access. He knew the union leaders, the businessmen, and the other dons who controlled the levers of money. That network, from Buffalo's John C. Montana to Florida's Santo Traficante Jr., gave him the authority to move freely between territories. Law enforcement came to describe the Bufalino family as small but significant. Its reach extended beyond Pennsylvania's anthracite belt, into New York, New Jersey, and the industrial Midwest. Bufalino's alliance with the Buffalo family ensured protection on one flank, while his long-term understanding with Carlo Gambino guaranteed stability on the other. When disputes broke out between the New York families and their affiliates, Bufalino was often called upon to mediate. His reputation as a rational, restrained negotiator earned him respect, even among men of greater wealth and notoriety. During the 1960s, the Bufalino organization was anchored in Pittston and Scranton, with satellite crews in Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton. The family's businesses appeared mundane: dress factories, laundries, and trucking companies, but beneath the surface, they laundered millions in gambling and union kickbacks. Bufalino's most profitable operations involved labor racketeering in the garment industry. His men controlled truck routes between New York and Pennsylvania, ensuring that union contracts favored those who paid. To the outside observer, these were simple transport firms. To investigators, They were the arteries of an invisible economy. The Teamster connection became one of Bufalino's most powerful assets. During the 1960s, organized labor was both a political and criminal battleground. The Teamsters Union, under Jimmy Hoffa, had vast pension funds and influence across industries. Hoffa, seeking allies who could enforce his will, found common cause with Bufalino. They were opposites in temperament. Hoffa, fiery and ambitious. Bufalino, calm and strategic. Yet they understood each other. Bufalino provided access and protection. Hoffa offered opportunity and financing. Their relationship drew scrutiny from the FBI, particularly under Robert F. Kennedy's Justice Department. Kennedy's Get Hoffa Squad targeted corruption in the Teamsters, tracing money from union funds to underworld investments. Among those links were companies tied to Pennsylvania and upstate New York. Though Bufalino's name surfaced repeatedly in investigations, direct evidence proved elusive. He remained the grey figure, mentioned often, indicted rarely, convicted only for narrow offences. Through the 1970s, as Hoffa's legal troubles mounted and his control over the Teamsters slipped, Bufalino remained a quiet counsellor. When Hoffa was imprisoned in 1967 for jury tampering, Bufalino visited him on several occasions, sometimes serving as intermediary between Hoffa and other underworld figures. After Hoffa's release in 1971, his attempts to regain control of the Union set him on a collision course with both his political rivals and organized crime leaders who preferred the status quo. When Hoffa disappeared on July 30, 1975, suspicion immediately turned to his underworld connections. Among the names cited by investigators was Russell Bufalino. The FBI believed he had attended a meeting with Hoffa and others shortly before the disappearance, possibly to mediate the dispute between Hoffa and Anthony Provenzano, a powerful Teamsters official linked to the Genovese family. Yet, as always, no direct link could be proved. Bufalino denied involvement and was never charged. To this day, Hoffa's disappearance remains one of the enduring mysteries of American organized crime, and Bufalino's role, if any, remains speculative. By then, the American Mafia was changing. The old commission system still existed, but its authority was weakening. Younger members, less disciplined than their predecessors, drew attention through violence and greed. Federal agencies, armed with new surveillance technology and the RICO statute of 1970, began dismantling entire families. The Philadelphia organization was torn apart by internal warfare. The Genovese and Gambino families faced a wave of convictions. Through it all, Bufalino's Pennsylvania operation remained relatively stable, protected by its low profile and lack of ambition beyond its established territory. Bufalino's leadership style reflected his personality: patient, cautious, unemotional. He avoided internal conflict by maintaining strict discipline and delegating authority to trusted lieutenants. Among them were men like Edward Ciandra and William Delia, who would later manage the family's day-to-day business. Ciandra, a cousin of Bufalino, acted as liaison to New York families, while Delia represented the new generation, educated, pragmatic, less tied to the street traditions of the past. Together, they preserved the family's structure, even as the mafia world around them crumbled. Still, federal attention never faded. In 1977, Bufalino was convicted of extortion for threatening a Pennsylvania businessman over a labor dispute. He served a short sentence, but the conviction marked a shift in his fortunes. By the 1980s, he was in his 70s, increasingly frail but still influential. Prosecutors pursued him again in 1981, accusing him of conspiring to murder a witness, but the case collapsed. Each time he seemed to slip through the net, an old man whose power was hard to quantify, yet impossible to deny. For law enforcement, the problem with Russell Bufalino was definition. He didn't fit the profile of a gangster. He lived modestly, wore plain suits, and spoke softly. His home in Kingston, Pennsylvania, was unassuming. Neighbors described him as polite and reserved. There were no entourages, no public displays of wealth. Yet wiretaps and informants confirmed that men from across the mafia spectrum continued to seek his counsel. To the FBI, he was the last of a breed, a boss who ruled not by fear, but by reputation. During the 1980s, the landscape of organized crime shifted irrevocably. The Gambino family, under Paul Castellano and later John Gotti, drew the public spotlight with unprecedented media attention. The Bonanos imploded under the weight of internal betrayal. The Philadelphia family descended into violence under Nicky Scarfo. Against that chaos, the Bufalino family's quiet endurance seemed almost anachronistic. Its rackets were old-fashioned: gambling, shylocking, labor deals. There were no flamboyant hits, no flashy crimes. That restraint kept them alive longer than most. Bufalino's health declined in the early 1980s, but he remained involved in decisions until shortly before his imprisonment in 1989. That year, he was sentenced to 10 years for conspiring to kill a government witness, his final conviction. Even then, his composure never wavered. At sentencing, he spoke only briefly, denying wrongdoing. "I've been in business all my life," he said quietly. "Never hurt anybody." To the agents who had spent decades pursuing him, it was the perfect epitaph for a man who had built a criminal empire on invisibility. He was released in the early 1990s, by then in his late 80s, and lived out his final years quietly in Pennsylvania. Russell Bufalino died in 1994. His funeral was small, attended by family, old associates, and a handful of aging underworld figures. There were no headlines, no national coverage, only a few local notices marking the death of a local businessman. In truth, his passing closed one of the last chapters of America's traditional mafia order. After his death, the family passed nominally to William D'Elia, who carried on operations into the 2000s. D'Elia's leadership marked the end of the line, modernized, careful, but under relentless federal scrutiny. He was arrested in 2006 on money laundering and conspiracy charges, effectively ending the Bufalino organization as a structured entity. What remained were fragments: independent operators, old loyalties, fading influence. Yet historians and agents alike still regard the Bufalino family as one of the most disciplined in mafia history. It avoided wars, minimized exposure, and survived longer than many of its larger counterparts. Its leaders, from Stephen LaTorre to Russell Bufalino, practiced a philosophy of control rooted in restraint. Where others sought fame, they sought stability. Where others expanded recklessly, they maintained balance. In retrospect, Russell Bufalino's career represents the arc of American organized crime itself, from the immigrant networks of the early 1900s to the corporate rackets of the post-war years, and finally to the decline under federal prosecution. His alliance with John C. Montana of Buffalo symbolized the interlocking structure of the old mafia order, regional families tied together by blood, business, and necessity. The Pennsylvania network's longevity came from its ability to remain useful as a courier, a mediator, a source of financing to more powerful families. By the time federal investigations subsided in the 2010s, what had once been the Bufalino empire existed only as history. But its influence lingers in the archives, in the FBI's declassified files, in court transcripts, and in the stories of those who crossed paths with Russell of Pennsylvania, the quiet boss who never needed to shout. He had outlasted nearly all his contemporaries. Genovese, dead in prison. Gambino, gone peacefully. Bonanno, in exile. Trafficante, in Florida soil. Each had commanded vast empires, each had left a trail of chaos. Bufalino's legacy, by contrast, was order. His world had been built in the coal towns and textile mills, not in the glamour of New York. His power was local, his style ancient. But in that simplicity lay survival, the defining lesson of his life and of the family that bore his name. It was alleged that in the early 1970s, he was appointed as an interim boss, or type of sanctioned overseer, of the Genovese crime family by the Commission, at a time when that crime family was experiencing internal difficulties. Congressman Dan Flood, who served northeastern Pennsylvania in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1945 to 1980, was investigated by at least 8 separate U.S. attorneys' offices and had 175 possible cases pending against him. A so-called muscler, Flood used his influence to direct federal contracts to people and corporations in exchange for cash kickbacks. The Flood-Medico-Bufalino triangle was one such instance. Medico Industries of Plains Township, Pennsylvania received, with Flood's help, a $4 million Department of Defense contract to produce 600,000 warheads for use in the Vietnam War. Bufalino, who frequented Medico offices, was an associate of General Manager William Medico, and President Philip Medico was a captain in the Bufalino crime family. The FBI discovered that Flood would often travel in the Medico Industries jet. Flood was eventually censured for bribery and resigned from the House in 1980. In 1977, Bufalino was indicted on extortion charges. He had threatened a man who owed $25,000 to a diamond fence associated with the Bufalino crime family. The debtor, who had been under law enforcement surveillance, decided to testify against Bufalino and enter the witness protection program. As soon as Bufalino was indicted, he took steps to reduce the possibility of further criminal charges. He named consigliere Edward Sciandra as acting boss and removed himself from the day-to-day operations of the family. On August 8, 1978, Bufalino was convicted and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment for his part in the extortion attempt. Regarding an incident during the sentencing, Russell Bufalino stated to the court, "If you had to deal with an animal like that, Judge, you'd have done the same damn thing." Once in prison, he used his longtime driver, William D'Elia, to maintain his personal affairs and deliver orders to the acting leaders. Edward Sciandra held the acting boss position from approximately 1975 until 1989. He was also imprisoned from 1981 to 1982. He began to gain power in the 1980s when he embezzled from a record company and expanded his personal rackets into New York City. During his time as acting boss, he expanded the family's operations into Florida as well. After his release from prison in the early 1980s, Bufalino also became a high-priority target for federal investigators. He was soon indicted for plotting to murder the debtor who had testified against him in 1977. Before the extortion trial, Bufalino had discovered the witness's hiding place and ordered hitman Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano to kill him. Unfortunately for Bufalino, Fratiano was a government informant. Fratiano later told Bufalino that he couldn't locate the witness. Now Fratiano was brought forward to testify against Bufalino. As a result, Bufalino was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. With Bufalino again in prison and the family under federal investigation, the organization's strength began to wane. Many family members were looking forward to retirement. Bufalino himself was now in his 80s and in ill health. In 1989, the day-to-day operation of the remainder of the Northeastern family was given to William D'Elia. At the end of the decade, Bufalino was released from prison. Despite his advanced age, he continued to be a significant influence within the mob and was continually watched by federal authorities. Bufalino died on February 25, 1994. Before Manhattan's skyline cast its full glare over the Atlantic, before the Coast Guard patrols dotted the dark waters outside Sandy Hook and Rockaway, before the Lawrence corruption scandals and gangland parades through Brooklyn's speakeasies, there were 2 men who shaped the earliest years of organized crime during Prohibition: Charles Vannie Higgins and Bill Dwyer. They were not the quiet kind of mobsters. They were not the patient chess players like Nick Savella or the political tacticians like Charles Banaggio. These were men who thrived in the open sea winds, who understood the value of brute force, and who shaped an era not with networks or unions, but with rum, bullets, and boats. The story of organized crime in New York cannot be told without them. Charles Vannie Higgins had a natural swagger, the kind of confident gait that made him look like he owned any street he walked on. Raised in Bay Ridge, hardened in the alleys of South Brooklyn, he grew up where loyalty and firepower meant survival. Higgins rose during Prohibition due to one thing above all else: he had daring. In those early years, being a rum runner required more than business acumen. It required a man willing to race the Coast Guard under moonlight with crates of French champagne tied down in his hull. Higgins became the most feared and respected rum runner in Brooklyn. His operations stretched from the New Jersey coastline to Long Island's outer beaches. His boats were fast, faster than anything the Coast Guard deployed, and he knew those waters like a sailor born on a mast. He was a smuggler, a gunman, and a businessman all in one. But Higgins had ambitions well beyond liquor. He wanted territory, and with territory came war. Organized crime in the 1920s was not the structured hierarchy it later became. Before the Commission, before Lucky Luciano reorganized the American Mafia, the underworld was messy. Ethnic enclaves competed violently. Bootleggers, Irish gangs, Sicilian crews, and Dutch Schultz's Harlem organization all intersected in a city bursting with illegal liquor profits. Into this storm stepped Higgins. He allied himself at different times with both Irish and Italian factions, but he kept himself independent. He didn't want subservience. He wanted a peace no one else could touch: Brooklyn's lucrative waterfront smuggling routes. This brought him into conflict with other gangs and sparked several gunfights that made newspaper headlines and police chiefs grind their teeth. Higgins' men were loyal. His enemies feared him. His operations were tight. He even cultivated romanticized folklore, stories of him swaggering into bars, buying drinks for everyone, and then quietly reminding them who owned the coast. But behind the bravado was a cunning tactician. Higgins bribed cops, paid off ward leaders, and built alliances with several New York political figures. He was dangerous, charismatic, and impossible to ignore, which meant he needed a partner, or at least a counterpart. Where Higgins was fire, Bill Dwyer was ice. William "Big Bill" Dwyer had size, presence, and an uncanny instinct for the beverages people secretly wanted and the officials who could be bought. An Irish stevedore with the face of a prize-fighter and the mind of a financier, Dwyer built one of the largest rum-running empires in the country. While Higgins raced speedboats and traded bullets with rivals, Dwyer bought politicians, rented judges, and owned half the docks between Chelsea and Hoboken. He had an engineer's sense of logistics. He knew which ships carried Bahamian rum, which captains could be bribed, and which customs officers could be quietly paid to misplace paperwork. Dwyer's empire stretched across the Atlantic shipping lanes. He coordinated fleets from foreign ports, turning Rum Row into a floating marketplace of liquor-laden cargo ships. Smaller boats, fast, agile, and often crewed by former fishermen, would dart out under cover of night, collect crates from the larger mother ships, and bring them ashore. This system made him rich beyond imagination, but riches bring enemies. Higgins and Dwyer were bound to cross paths. Both ruled different sides of the Prohibition world. Higgins on the water close to shore, Dwyer on the shipping lines stretching across international borders. Their territories overlapped, their suppliers overlapped, and their men often worked side by side on stretches of water where law enforcement feared to go. Though their personalities clashed, Higgins wild and loud, Dwyer reserved and strategic, they shared mutual respect. Each understood the other's importance in the larger bootlegging ecosystem. Their partnership was not a formal arrangement, but an understood one. Higgins kept Brooklyn secure. Dwyer kept the ocean supply chains secure. Together, intentionally or not, they created an era. But nothing in the 1920s stayed stable for long. Dwyer's empire became too big to hide. Politicians he once counted as allies grew nervous. Reform movements in New York began exposing corruption within the police force and city contracts. Prosecutors, hungry for public approval, targeted high-profile figures. Dwyer was arrested multiple times for conspiracy and bribery. His trial exposed many of the inner workings of Rum Row. Although he was not convicted in every case, the damage was done. His political protection began to crack. His financial empire suffered. Forced out of bootlegging by the tightening vice of federal law enforcement, Big Bill did what any hustler of his era might do. He invested his money in sports teams, specifically hockey. He became part owner of the New York Americans and later the New York Rangers. His criminal empire collapsed, but his reputation as a bootlegging mastermind lived on. Higgins faced a different fate. His conflicts with rivals escalated during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Shootouts involving Higgins' men became sensational tabloid material. As the Prohibition era reached its final volatile years, Higgins' influence began slipping. Enforcement intensified, competitors grew stronger, and the Italians began organizing under Luciano and his allies. Higgins, stubborn and fiercely proud, refused to yield territory. He fought back against rival gangs, especially Dutch Schultz's encroaching Harlem network. In his world, surrender was death. His end came violently. Higgins was gunned down in 1932, killed outside a dance hall in a blaze of bullets, a fittingly dramatic end for a man who lived fast and fought harder. His death marked the symbolic fading of the independent Irish-American rum runners and the rise of the more structured American mafia. Together, Higgins and Dwyer shaped the first great wave of organized crime in New York. They set the stage for what was coming: Luciano's reorganization, the five families, the commission, and the Italian dominance of the underworld. They created the template others built upon: territorial control, political bribery, financial networks, maritime smuggling systems, strategic alliances. These were the foundations of modern organized crime. As the 1930s dawned, their era ended. But in their wake came a new breed of gangster, more polished, more cunning, and more deeply embedded in national networks. There are gangsters who rise quietly. There are gangsters who rule from shadows. And then there was Jack Legs Diamond. No figure in New York's Prohibition underworld burned brighter or lived wilder. Where Dwyer was calculated and Higgins disciplined in his chaos, Diamond was a storm, a one-man hurricane of ambition, charm, and violence. His life wasn't just criminal, it was theatrical. His story reads like a pulp novel soaked in whiskey and gunpowder. He was a man impossible to ignore and even harder to kill. Born Jack Moran, Diamond came into the world already behind enemy lines. His father, an Irish immigrant, struggled for steady work, and the Moran boys grew up navigating the rough edges of Philadelphia. Jack learned early how to talk his way out of trouble, and more importantly, how to shoot his way out if talking didn't work. By his late teens, he was already a thief. By his early 20s, he was already a fugitive. And by the time he drifted into New York in the early 1920s, he carried the presence of a man hungry for a kingdom. New York in those years was a criminal gold rush. Rum from Dwyer's ships flooded the docks. Higgins' boats sliced through Brooklyn waters. Sicilian and Jewish gangs were forming dangerous alliances. Diamond smelled opportunity. Before he became a headline, Diamond was a bodyguard and enforcer for Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler who financed everyone and feared no one. Rothstein took a liking to the handsome Irishman with the quick draw and quicker grin. Through Rothstein, Diamond crossed paths with a young, ambitious Charles Lucky Luciano, and for a time the two operated in the same orbit. Luciano used Diamond as muscle, never fully trusting him, but understanding his value. Diamond's small crew helped with hijackings, liquor protection, and high-risk smuggling jobs. Yet Diamond never accepted being subordinate. He wanted his own turf, his own money, his own legend. This ambition would define and destroy him. Every gangster dreams of territory. Diamond dreamed bigger. While Dwyer built maritime empires and Higgins ran coastlines, Diamond moved north, into Albany. The city was ripe, politicians fractured, law enforcement poorly coordinated, and bootlegging controls weak. Diamond established gambling houses, brothels, and liquor networks across the region. He bribed officials when he could, threatened those he couldn't. Albany, for a few fleeting years, became his. But where there is expansion, there is conflict. Local bootleggers resented him, police despised him, and rival gangs believed he was a reckless hothead, dangerous because he was unpredictable. Diamond survived so many assassination attempts that newspapers dubbed him the Clay Pigeon and the man who couldn't be killed. He was ambushed in Manhattan hotels, shot on roadways, cornered in bars, and once left for dead in a gutter. Each time, he emerged bandaged and smirking. His reputation became mythological. Newspapers splashed his face across front pages, reporters begged for interviews. Diamond played into it, posing in silk bathrobes, smiling through bullet wounds, recounting shootouts like bedtime stories. This fame, intoxicating as it was, made him untouchable in the eyes of the public and intolerable in the eyes of rival mobsters. Where Higgins and Dwyer built empires that supported the early foundations of organized crime, Diamond built a cult of personality that threatened its stability. The Italians, Luciano, Masseria's remnants, the rising Genovese faction, concluded Diamond was a liability, and liabilities in their world were removed. Diamond's success in Albany collapsed under the weight of his own ego. He grew erratic, fighting in clubs, attacking rivals in broad daylight, and forcing partnerships instead of negotiating them. He believed he was invincible. He wasn't. His crew began splintering, lured away by safer, more profitable alliances. His brother Eddie, his closest confidant, was killed in a gangland shooting, a loss that shattered Diamond's emotional balance. Diamond tried rebuilding from New York, but the mafia had grown organized under Luciano. Commission rules now governed territory and conduct. Men like Diamond, independent, unpredictable, and Irish, had no place in this new order. By the early 1930s, he had more enemies than friends, which means his fate was sealed. Diamond's end came not in a violent street battle or a car chase across the Hudson, but in a quiet boarding house in Albany. He had just been acquitted of charges related to a kidnapping and celebrated the victory with champagne and a showgirl, his last indulgence. While he slept, someone slipped into his room and shot him 3 times in the back of the head. The killer was never officially identified, but everyone knew. New York's underworld had spoken. Jack Diamond's reign was over. Legs Diamond differed from Higgins and Dwyer in fundamental ways. Higgins ruled through control of territory. Dwyer ruled through logistics and political influence. Diamond ruled through spectacle, a gangster celebrity who thrived on chaos. If Higgins and Dwyer represented the old wild rum-running era, Diamond represented the transitional gangster, loud, reckless, but undeniably magnetic. His fall helped usher in the era of disciplined organization, paving the way for Luciano's commission and the structured 5 families system. But Diamond's story doesn't end with his death, where society, crime, fame, and tragedy converge. Anthony Carfano was the type of gangster who did not need to announce his presence. Those who mattered already knew. Quietly dressed, impeccably groomed, carrying himself with the soft confidence of a man who had survived every shifting tide of New York's underworld, Carfano belonged to a different generation than the rum kings and the wild gunmen who came before him. Where Higgins charged the coastline with guns blazing and Diamond danced his way through gunfire, Carfano built influence with patience, charm, and a certain gentlemanly demeanor that made him welcome in both high society and the darkest corners of the city. Born into the Sicilian enclaves of Manhattan's East Harlem, Carfano, known in his youth as Little Augie Pisano, grew up in a world where the early Italian gangs were still figuring out how to organize themselves. He watched the rise of the old bosses, saw the revolutions brought on by the Morello brothers, and later witnessed the transformation orchestrated by Luciano, Genovese, and the architects of the American Mafia's new structure. Carfano was not a visionary, nor did he pretend to be. What he possessed was the rare ability to survive every reshuffling of the deck. By the late 1930s and 1940s, when Lucky Luciano had reorganized the underworld and Vito Genovese carved out his climb toward power, Carfano settled into his role as a trusted senior figure within the Genovese family. He handled gambling interests, union schemes, nightclub operations, and various rackets stretching from New York to Florida. He had enough authority to command respect, enough discretion to avoid attracting unnecessary attention, and enough political savvy to navigate the dangerous currents of mafia diplomacy. He was not a household name. He preferred it that way. Carfano understood something that the earlier generation, men like Higgins and Diamond, never did. Visibility is death. Fame is a curse. A gangster survives by being the man in the corner of the restaurant, not the one posing for newspapers. Carfano avoided headlines and kept his associations limited to those he trusted. But even for a man who valued quiet control, fate has a way of placing unexpected people in one's orbit. Janice Drake did not grow up in the underworld. She was born into a modest family in New Jersey, bright, charming, and ambitious. She became a model, entered beauty pageants, collected trophies, and eventually became a familiar face in the New York entertainment scene. Drake possessed the kind of effortless elegance that made her welcome at charity events, nightclub openings, and boxing after-parties. She married a professional boxer named Eddie "Pappy" Young, a fighter with a promising career who brushed shoulders with both legitimate promoters and shady bookmakers. Through her husband's profession, Janice found herself slowly pulled into the orbit of people who lived double lives. Glamour in public, shadows in private. Her world changed forever in 1959 when her husband was murdered, shot in a grim underworld dispute that never entirely made sense to outsiders. Drake, grieving and isolated, drifted into the arms of men who offered comfort, companionship, and a break from the sorrow that had overtaken her life. It was during this vulnerable period that she became associated with Carfano. Whether the two were romantically involved, quietly friendly, or simply sharing mutual company on the night they died, has long been debated. What is certain is that they became linked in one of the most shocking killings of the post-war era. By the late 1950s, Carfano's position in the Genovese hierarchy had become complicated. The old world of mob politics was shifting once again. Vito Genovese, obsessed with consolidating power, was purging rivals real and imagined. Internal tensions fractured alliances that had existed for decades. Carfano's influence in Florida, where he oversaw gambling and political relationships, placed him in a precarious position. Rumors circulated that Genovese resented him, distrusted him, or viewed him as a potential threat. In the mafia, none of these things needed to be proven to become a death sentence. Carfano knew the landscape was changing. He had navigated such transitions before, but something about the mood of 1959, the paranoia within the families, the aggressive push by Genovese to control every lucrative territory, was different. Friends advised him to stay cautious. Associates whispered that the winds were shifting. But Carfano, calm and confident as ever, believed his decades of loyalty granted him safety. On the night of September 24, 1959, Carfano and Janice Drake attended the Copacabana, the famous Manhattan nightclub where celebrities, athletes, and mobsters shared the same smoke-heavy air. The two appeared relaxed, elegant, and entirely at ease, unaware of the dark machinery moving behind the scenes. After leaving the club, they took a ride in Carfano's Cadillac, a ride that would become their final journey. Somewhere in Queens, the Cadillac was stopped. The details are murky, but what is known is that both Carfano and Drake were forced into the back seat. Their killer sat with them. Then, the car veered toward a deserted stretch near the airport. It was there, in the quiet dark, that the gunman carried out his orders. 2 shots for Carfano, 1 for Drake. Their bodies were found slumped together in the back seat, elegant clothing stained, the night suddenly stripped of its glamour. The murder sent a chill through both high society and the underworld. Carfano was a known figure among mafia circles, respected, connected, established. Killing him was a statement. Killing Janice Drake was something else entirely, a reminder of how far the mafia's reach extended and how ruthlessly they eliminated anyone who might be perceived as a risk, even a woman with no criminal ties beyond her associations. Theories circled quickly. Some believed Genovese ordered the hit personally, a preemptive strike against a man he feared might oppose him. Others whispered that Florida politics or casino interests lay behind the murder, that Carfano's influence in Miami and Tampa had created enemies too powerful to ignore. The most chilling theory suggested that Drake was killed simply because she was a witness, an innocent woman swept into the path of forces she never truly understood. Her death became a tragic symbol, a woman of beauty, talent, and vulnerability, caught in the crossfire of men who lived by rules she never chose to follow. As for Carfano, his death represented the final, quiet erasure of the old generation of American mobsters. Men like him had run rackets before the Commission existed, before Luciano reshaped the world, before the mafia became a national institution. He belonged to an era where personal relationships still mattered, where individual reputations held weight, where diplomacy and long memories were as valuable as bullets. But by the late 1950s, crime families were no longer small clusters of men operating in localized territories. They were powerful corporations with rigid structures. The new leaders did not value sentimental loyalty. They valued efficiency. A man like Carfano, who bridged the old world and the new, who commanded respect independent of his bosses, was no longer an asset. He was a liability. And liabilities in the mafia were erased. The deaths of Carfano and Drake closed the chapter on a long lineage of underworld evolution. From Higgins racing rumboats through moonlit waters, to Dwyer building empires from the docks, to Diamond blazing through the city like a comet, and finally to Carfano navigating the dangerous corridors of mafia politics, each represented a distinct era in New York's transformation from chaotic street gangs to organized crime syndicates. Drake's death, unlike the others, was a reminder of how the underworld did not merely shape the lives of criminals. It pulled innocence into its orbit. Philip Little Farvel Cohen moved through the underworld like a whisper and a shadow. Small in frame but mighty in influence, he was a man of contradictions, deadly yet discreet, brutal yet business-savvy. His name becomes nearly mythic in the annals of organized crime, not merely because of his reputation for violence, but because he embodied something far more ominous, the intersection of murder, money, and international narcotics. He was not just a hired killer, he was a high-level operator in Murder, Inc., and one of its most trusted lieutenants. Born around 1906 or 1907 in the Russian Empire, Cohen immigrated to New York as a youth, like many who fled poverty and persecution. But his American dream had a darker edge. He gravitated into Brooklyn's tough neighborhoods, where union rackets, street-level protection, and racketeering were as familiar as the tenement wall. Even in his early years, he showed a rare combination of traits, a willingness to commit violence, but also a mind for enterprise, a soldier in the street war, but also a financier in the shadows. Cohen's transformation into Little Farvel came through his relationship with Louis Lepke Buchalter, the leader of a powerful criminal syndicate that would later spawn Murder, Inc. Lepke's organization was ruthless and highly organized. He had muscle, but he also had a vision, a syndicate that crossed ethnic lines, that leveraged legal industries, and most importantly, that understood how to scale violence and profit simultaneously. In that world, Cohen found his niche. He was a killer, yes, but he was more than that. He also managed international drug operations. By the mid-1930s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics (FBN) had identified him, along with his partner, Emanuel Mendy Weiss, as one of the key traffickers in opium, morphine, and heroin destined for US markets. The FBN would later assert that much of the drug smuggling destined for America was backed by Murder Inc. And Cohen was at the center of that enterprise. The narcotics network Cohen helped run wasn't ragtag. It was methodical, global, dangerous. Opium was imported through European and Asian routes, particularly from China, and shipped in clandestine loads into US ports. From there, the product was refined. Agents once raided an apartment on Seymour Avenue in New York and discovered what looked like an unassuming residential building. Under the floorboards, in hidden rooms, they found a chemical lab, vats, distillation equipment, and traces of morphine. This was not amateur hour. This was a business. Working alongside Cohen was Emanuel Weiss, known in the underworld as Mendy. Weiss had been a trusted enforcer for Lepke since the early 1920s, cutting his teeth in union rackets and garment industry extortion. Over time, he became more than muscle. He became a central figure in both the murder-for-hire operations and the shady financial network of the syndicate. He and Cohen shared both ambition and discretion. Together, they managed the drug trade, braced murders, and protected Lepke's broader empire. Weiss had a cold efficiency. He was tall, imposing, and deadly calm. His reputation was not built on flashy violence, but on results. He was involved in some of the biggest contract killings. The hitting of Dutch Schultz in Newark, for example, was one of his major operations. On October 23, 1935, he and Charles the Bug Workman walked into the Palace Chop House. Weiss, with steely composure, allegedly told the staff to take cover before the gunfire erupted. Schultz and his men were gunned down. Weiss escaped quickly, ordering the getaway driver to speed away. A classic hit, executed with cold, calculated precision. As time passed, the relationship between Cohen and Weiss deepened. Their collaboration wasn't casual, it was institutional. Murder Inc. was not just a killing squad. It was a structure built to protect profit, to eliminate risk, and to maintain the syndicate's power. Cohen and Weiss were essential to that. They organized operations, handled logistics, coordinated with overseas suppliers, and occasionally dealt with witnesses, threats, and betrayals. Their ambitions drew the attention of law enforcement. In 1939, in a dramatic house search, FBN agents uncovered clear evidence of Cohen and Weiss's drug enterprise. They found records, lab equipment, and traces of narcotics in a Brooklyn location. Arrests followed. The indictment wasn't limited to the two men. 5 others were named along with them. Samuel Bernstein, Abe, Little Yiddle Lorber, and Al Angelson among them, all accused of participating in the chemical processing ring. The trial that followed was consequential. By February of 1941, Cohen was convicted on narcotics charges. He was sentenced to between 3 and 10 years, ultimately receiving the maximum 10. Weiss, by that point, was also under heavy legal pressure, though his conviction for narcotics would remain elusive. The FBN maintained that Weiss was deeply involved, but they lacked hard, prosecutable evidence for some charges. Still, his association with Cohen and Murder Inc. made him a public enemy. But the underworld never lets power go quietly. While Cohen was sentenced for drugs, he was also implicated, though never tried, for murder. One of the most notorious unsolved cases connected to him was the double slaying of Danny Fields, also known as Isidore Friedman, and Louis Cohen, on January 28, 1939. Prosecutors believed Cohen may have been one of the shooters, but the case lacked enough reliable evidence to bring charges. In that violent world, silence was often as lethal as a bullet. By 1940s, the pressure on Murder Inc. was mounting. Other kingpins, including Lepke himself, were being arrested, indicted, tried. Weiss, Cohen, and their associates found themselves in legal crosshairs from multiple directions. In one courtroom drama, prosecutors tried to charge them for murder, sometimes using testimony from syndicate insiders who had turned state's evidence. But not every case stuck. While Cohen was serving his drug sentence, Weiss faced another fate. He was indicted for murder, particularly linked to the Rosen killing, the 1936 execution of Joseph Rosen, a former horse owner who had run afoul of the syndicate. According to informants, Weiss was one of the hitmen. The prosecution presented a case that involved internal syndicate testimony, hit logistics, and the brutal efficiency Murder, Inc. was known for. In 1941, both men were in the crosshairs of major trials. Weiss was eventually convicted for Rosen's murder, sentenced to death, and executed. His final words, reportedly, were defiant. He claimed the case against him was framed, and as he awaited the executioner, he insisted on his loyalty to his people and his code. Cohen, meanwhile, survived prison and was eventually released. But freedom did not mean safety. On September 15, 1949, he was found dead on a quiet stretch of Long Island Road. His body bore 4 bullet wounds to the head. In the passenger seat of his car, traces of his blood were found. A classic underworld execution. There was no robbery. Nothing was taken. This was not random, it was definitive. Rumors swirled. Some believed his killing was revenge by those who resented his return. Others said it was a power play, new syndicate leaders eliminating a potential rival. Still, other voices suggested he may have tried to muscle back into operations, pushing out newer players who had grown while he was behind bars. Through all this, Cohen's reputation remained intact among old-timers. He never cooperated with prosecutors or named names. To the end, he was loyal to the code, even if that code demanded his death in return. In the story of Murder, Inc., Cohen is critical not just as a killer, but as a builder of its business side. He and Weiss represent the hybrid gangster, part executioner, part businessman. Their operations show that Murder, Inc. was more than a death squad. It was deeply involved in narcotics, in extortion, in union influence, running a network that spanned not just New York, but international supply chains. Weiss's execution was a symbol, the fall of the old guard, the crumbling of the violent syndicate that had once seemed unstoppable. Cohen's death was poetic justice, or perhaps tragic inevitability, for a man who wielded power quietly but dangerously, and who operated in the liminal space between murder and commerce. In the end, Philip Little Farvel Cohen remains one of organized crime's most enigmatic figures. He was ruthless but not reckless, criminal but deeply strategic. His life was a mirror of Murder, Inc.'s paradoxes, a group built for killing but also for protecting profit, a cabal of hitmen who were also smuggling kingpins, enforcers who understood the value of silence. And with him and Weiss gone, the age of Murder, Inc. passed. Their world, violent, profitable, unrepentant, ended, but the blueprint they helped build lived on in the modern structures of organized crime. Charles Vannie Higgins was a New York mobster and one of the most prominent bootleggers during the Prohibition era. Known as Brooklyn's last Irish boss, Higgins was notorious for his escapes from law enforcement. He was born in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, New York. He would learn pickpocketing, theft, and other profitable crimes as a teen while running with his crew on the streets of New York. By 1916, he had been arrested for assault at least twice, but was put on probation. At the beginning of Prohibition, he had formed a small-time gang which started to operate outside of the Bay Ridge area. After taking control of Big Bill Dwyer's bootlegging operations with partner Frank Costello in 1927, they began importing high-quality Canadian liquor for Dwyer's high society clientele. By the mid-1920s, his rum-running operations included a fleet of taxis, loading trucks, as well as several planes and numerous speedboats, which were used for smuggling alcohol into the United States from Canada. The cigarette was described as the fastest rum runner in New York. Higgins, himself a licensed pilot, often used his planes for personal use. During a business trip in Baltimore, he was a witness to a gang fight between rival bootleggers while visiting a local speakeasy, and, while deciding to leave the premises, he was mistaken for one of the fighting bootleggers and shot in the leg by a local police officer. Higgins soon began moving into Manhattan. He would come into conflict with Dutch Schultz and his gang. During the Manhattan Beer War, Vanny aligned himself with Jack Legs Diamond, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, and Anthony Carfano to take on Schultz's gang. Charles Higgins reportedly stated, "I don't let my boys take risks I don't take," at the scene of many gun battles between himself and Schultz during 1928. During one such incident, Higgins and gunman William Bad Bill Bailey were seen fleeing the scene after fighting rival gunmen at Brooklyn's Owlhead Cafe on 69th Street and 3rd Avenue. Patrolman Daniel Maloney was killed in the crossfire by fellow police officers during the March 1929 incident. Higgins, Bailey, and another gunman were arrested several weeks later in connection with the death of Brooklyn bootlegger Samuel Orlando, who was killed during the incident. They were identified by witnesses as the rival gangsters who had gunned Samuel Orlando down. By the time of his trial, however, none of the witnesses could be found, and the mobsters were acquitted of all charges. Several months later, Higgins and Bailey were shot at in an attempted drive-by shooting by supporters of Samuel Orlando. A colorful character in public life, Higgins made public appearances and often posed for news photographers, as he dressed in expensive suits and was often driven around in various limousines. Although almost always surrounded by bodyguards, Higgins had earned a reputation for recklessness in gang battles. His offices and residence were known to be well stocked with weapons. When Higgins acquired a shipment of grenades from a military arsenal, he and Jack Legs Diamond used them against Dutch Schultz's speakeasies during their war with a rival gangster. In 1931, Higgins led his men into the Manhattan's Blossom Heath Inn on West 57th Street, where he visited the owner, Frank McManus. McManus was the brother of George Hump McManus, a suspect in the 1928 murder of Arnold Rothstein. When Charles Higgins refused to leave, an argument broke out with the owner over a shipment. Then a fight broke out in which Higgins would suffer serious stab wounds. When taken to the hospital, Higgins refused to identify his attacker to authorities while being questioned during his recovery. Later that year, Higgins and Bailey were suspected in the death of Robert Whitey Benson, who was a member of Higgins's organization. He was suspected of secretly working for rival Dutch Schultz and informing him on the inner workings of Higgins' organization, including important details on liquor shipments and payoffs. Although arrested for the murder, the two were once again acquitted due to lack of evidence. Enjoying extensive political protection from many of New York's politicians and public officials, Higgins was allowed to land his plane at the state prison of Comstock, New York, where he had dinner with childhood friend and warden, Joseph H. Wilson. Although Wilson was criticized by then New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, Wilson maintained he had the right to entertain anyone he wanted. On the night of June 18, 1932, after attending his daughter's tap dance recital at the Knights of Columbus Clubhouse in Prospect Park, Charles Higgins was gunned down in the street while trying to protect his 7-year-old daughter. He was taken to the Methodist Hospital by local police. Despite police attempts to question him, Higgins refused to answer any questions regarding the shooting. He died the following afternoon.
Charles Vanny Higgins was a New York mobster and one of the most prominent bootleggers during the Prohibition era. Known as Brooklyn's last Irish boss, Higgins was notorious for his escapes from law enforcement. He was born in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, New York. He would learn pickpocketing, theft, and other profitable crimes as a teen while running with his crew on the streets of New York. By 1916, he had been arrested for assault at least twice, but was put on probation. At the beginning of Prohibition, he had formed a small-time gang which started to operate outside of the Bay Ridge area. After taking control of Big Build Wire's bootlegging operations with partner Frank Costello in 1927, they began importing high-quality Canadian liquor for Dwyer's high society clientele. By the mid-1920s, his rum-running operations included a fleet of taxis, loading trucks, as well as several planes and numerous speedboats which were used for smuggling alcohol into the United States from Canada. The cigarette was described as the fastest rum runner in New York. Higgins, himself a licensed pilot, often used his planes for personal use. During a business trip in Baltimore, he was a witness to a gang fight between rival bootleggers while visiting a local speakeasy and, while deciding to leave the premises, he was mistaken for one of the fighting bootleggers and shot in the leg by a local police officer. Higgins soon began moving into Manhattan. He would come into conflict with Dutch Schultz and his gang. During the Manhattan Beer War, Vanny aligned himself with Jack Legs Diamond, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, and Anthony Carfano to take on Schultz's gang. Charles Higgins reportedly stated, "I don't let my boys take risks I don't take," at the scene of many gun battles between himself and Schultz during 1928. During one such incident, Higgins and gunman William Bad Bill Bailey were seen fleeing the scene after fighting rival gunmen at Brooklyn's Owl Head Cafe on 69th Street and 3rd Avenue. Patrolman Daniel Maloney was killed in the crossfire by fellow arriving police officers during the March 1929 incident. Higgins, Bailey and another gunman were arrested several weeks later in connection with the death of Brooklyn bootlegger Samuel Orlando, who was killed during the incident. They were identified by witnesses as the rival gangsters who had gunned Samuel Orlando down. By the time of his trial, however, none of the witnesses could be found and the mobsters were acquitted of all charges. Several months later, Higgins and Bailey were shot at in an attempted drive-by shooting by supporters of Samuel Orlando. A colorful character in public life, Higgins made public appearances and often posed for news photographers as he dressed in expensive suits and was often driven around in various limousines. Although almost always surrounded by bodyguards, Higgins had earned a reputation for recklessness in gang battles. His offices and residence were known to be well stocked with weapons. When Higgins acquired a shipment of grenades from a military arsenal, he and Jack Legs Diamond used them against Dutch Schultz's speakeasies during their war with the rival gangster. In 1931, Higgins led his men into the Manhattan's Blossom Heath Inn on West 57th Street, where he visited the owner, Frank McManus. McManus was the brother of George Hump McManus, a suspect in the 1928 murder of Arnold Rothstein. When Charles Higgins refused to leave, an argument broke out with the owner over a shipment, then a fight broke out in which Higgins would suffer serious stab wounds. When taken to the hospital, Higgins refused to identify his attacker to authorities while being questioned during his recovery. Later that year, Higgins and Bailey were suspected in the death of Robert Whitey Benson, who was a member of Higgins' organization. He was suspected of secretly working for rival Dutch Schultz and informing him on the inner workings of Higgins' organization, including important details on liquor shipments and payoffs. Although arrested for the murder, the two were once again acquitted due to lack of evidence. Enjoying extensive political protection from many of New York's politicians and public officials, Higgins was allowed to land his plane at the state prison of Comstock, New York, where he had dinner with childhood friend and warden, Joseph H. Wilson. Although Wilson was criticized by then New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, Wilson maintained he had the right to entertain anyone he wanted. On the night of June 18, 1932, after attending his daughter's tap dance recital at the Knights of Columbus Clubhouse in Prospect Park, Charles Higgins was gunned down in the street while trying to protect his 7-year-old daughter. He was taken to the Methodist Hospital by local police. Despite police attempts to question him, Higgins refused to answer any questions regarding the shooting. He died the following afternoon.